The military hospital aboard the Galactic Station was in full swing, with medics scrambling to tend to the fresh wave of wounded soldiers returning from the most recent skirmish. Amidst the busy chaos, a striking alien nurse named Xenia moved purposefully, her focus locked on her latest patient, a human male, his chestnut hair tousled and a faint shadow of stubble on his chiseled jaw. Xenia's emerald-green skin glistened under the bright lights of the medbay as she carefully pushed a strand of her vibrant blue hair behind her ear. To her species, humans were still an exotic mystery, and she couldn't help but be fascinated by the foreign male's unusual features as he lay unconscious on the hospital bed. "What's his status?" she asked, glancing up at the medical chart. "Stable," the lead doctor responded, his face tense. "He took a heavy blow to the head. He's likely to remain unconscious for some time. Standard protocol. He'll need a sponge bath." Xenia nodded and went about gathering her supplies. She took great pride in her work, striving to give the best care possible, even to these unfamiliar new allies. She filled a basin with warm, soapy water and began gently cleansing the man's battered body. Her gaze lingered on his muscular frame, so different from the slender build typical of her species. A warmth spread through her, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to be held by those powerful arms. Xenia quickly shook off the thought, returning to her duties. As she moved lower, she ran the sponge along his legs. Suddenly, her heart stopped. By the 7 moons, what was that? She jumped back, her eyes wide in shock, as she noticed something growing between his legs, swelling at an alarming rate. In all her studies, she had never encountered anything like it. Panic gripped her as she called for help. "Doctor, please come quickly," she exclaimed, feeling the urgency in her voice. "I think he's coding." The lead doctor rushed over, but upon seeing the situation, he burst into laughter. One by one, the other medical staff joined in. "Sweetie, honey, don't worry," an older nurse said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. "That's not a code. That's just his little soldier standing at attention." Xenia stared at them in confusion. "But isn't this a sign of imminent death in humans?" "Far from it," the doctor replied with a smirk. "It's a perfectly natural response. Human males have quite the equipment down there. Congratulations, nurse. It seems your touch was a little more stimulating than you realized." Xenia's cheeks burned a vivid purple as embarrassment washed over her. She'd never lived this down. She quickly straightened her shoulders, trying to regain her composure. Determined not to let the teasing bother her, Xenia continued the bath, focusing on her task while doing her best to ignore the knowing looks from her colleagues. Despite the embarrassment, her curiosity was piqued. She couldn't help but sneak glances at the humans' unexpected condition. Humans were proving to be far more fascinating than she had ever imagined. Over the next few days, Xenia found herself volunteering for every shift with this particular soldier. She told herself it was to make up for the earlier blunder, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. Something about this man was drawing her in. One evening, as Xenia adjusted his pillow, the human's eyes fluttered open, locking onto hers. Her heart raced. "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. Xenia swallowed hard. "You're safe. You were wounded in battle, but you're in the hospital now. We've been taking care of you." A weak smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Well, I must have died and gone to heaven," he murmured, his eyes shining with admiration. "Because I'm looking at an angel." Xenia's cheeks turned an even deeper shade of purple. She wasn't sure if his words were a compliment or a result of delirium, but the thrill they sent through her was undeniable. Just then, the doctor entered the room, breaking the moment. "Ah, Sergeant Taylor," he greeted cheerfully. "Glad to see you've rejoined the land of the living. You gave us quite a scare, especially poor Xenia here. She thought your morning glory meant you were on death's door." The doctor laughed heartily, and to Xenia's surprise, Taylor joined in with a chuckle. He glanced over at her with a mischievous grin. "Well, Nurse Xenia, if you ever want to get better acquainted with my swelling, I'm more than happy to oblige." Xenia's cheeks turned an even darker shade of green, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the undeniable bulge beneath the sheets. The attraction she felt was confusing but exciting. As the days passed and Taylor began his recovery, Xenia found herself eagerly volunteering for his physical therapy sessions. She told herself it was for professional reasons, but every time she was near him, her pulse quickened. One day, as she helped him with basic stretches, she couldn't help but notice the way his muscles flexed under his skin-tight workout clothes. When she adjusted his posture, she lingered just a bit too long, feeling the firmness of his body beneath her fingertips. Taylor, for his part, seemed to enjoy every second of it, even making exaggerated grunts with each movement. "You're really putting me through my paces, nurse. I might need some special care after this," he teased, grinning. Xenia rolled her eyes, but the smile tugging at her lips betrayed her. "I think you'll survive, tough guy." As she handed him a set of resistance bands, her fingers brushed against his. Taylor's breath hitched, his pupils dilating as he looked at her with unmistakable desire. "See something you like, nurse?" Xenia's emerald cheeks flushed even deeper, but she was determined to rise to his challenge. "Just admiring your form, Sergeant. You seem to be making great progress." "Well, I aim to impress," he said with a sly grin, flexing his biceps. "But I might need a bit more hands-on assistance with my next set." Xenia's heart raced, her body yearning for something more. When she placed her hands on his hips to guide him through squats, she felt the heat radiating from his body. Her pulse quickened as his hands touched her in ways she hadn't expected. Suddenly, Taylor lost his balance, tumbling backward, pulling Xenia with him. They landed in a tangled heap on the exercise mat, their faces inches apart, both panting heavily. Taylor's arousal pressed insistently against her thigh, and for a brief moment, they stared at each other, breathless. "I guess I fell for you," he whispered, his voice low and husky. Xenia's heart raced. We shouldn't." Before she could say more, Taylor silenced her with a searing kiss. The world seemed to melt away as Xenia gave in to the passion she had tried so hard to ignore. Just as his hand started to undo the zipper of her jumpsuit, a loud cough interrupted them. Xenia pulled away quickly, her cheeks burning as she scrambled to fix her appearance. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," the doctor teased, arching an eyebrow. Xenia's voice was higher than usual as she stammered, "Not at all. We were just working on core exercises." The doctor simply shook his head and chuckled. "Well, carry on then. But try to keep it professional, you two." As the doctor left, Xenia turned back to Taylor, her heart pounding with unfulfilled desire. "We can't do this again," she whispered. "It's too risky." Taylor reached out, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear with gentle tenderness. "It feels right, Xenia," he murmured. "I've never wanted anyone like I want you." Xenia closed her eyes, torn between duty and desire. She knew falling for a patient was a dangerous path, but how could she resist the pull she felt towards him? With a heavy sigh, she stepped back, putting distance between them. "Let's just focus on getting you better, Sergeant." One step at a time, Taylor nodded, a soft smile playing on his lips. "As you wish, nurse. But know this, I'm not giving up on us that easily." Xenia couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to become much more complicated and much more thrilling. The days since the awkward encounter in the therapy room had been a whirlwind for Xenia. She was determined to keep things professional, but her thoughts were never far from Sergeant Taylor. Each time she saw him, her heart raced, her mind filled with conflicted emotions she could barely understand. Despite her best efforts to keep a clear boundary, Taylor's playful, teasing nature seemed to pull her in further. She caught herself stealing glances at him, her fingers trembling whenever they brushed against his skin during their sessions. His roguish grin and charm were hard to resist, and it was becoming more difficult to ignore the growing attraction between them. As Xenia prepared for another shift in the hospital, she was once again assigned to oversee Taylor's physical therapy. She arrived at his room, her mind swirling with a mixture of anticipation and unease. She could hear the faint sound of movement from within, and her heart fluttered. She entered and saw Taylor sitting on the edge of his bed, stretching out his injured leg, his muscular arms flexing as he worked. His sharp blue eyes met hers, and he gave her a knowing, lazy smile. The way he looked at her sent a shiver down her spine. "Hey, Nurse Xenia," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Ready to get me back to 100% today?" Xenia's cheeks flushed green, but she forced herself to appear calm. "Let's start with some basic stretches," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. She motioned for him to lie down on the mat, and he complied, his eyes never leaving hers. As Xenia adjusted his position, her fingers brushed against his chest, and she felt a jolt of electricity run through her. Her breath caught in her throat, but she remained focused. She couldn't let herself get distracted. She had a job to do. "You've made a lot of progress," Xenia commented, trying to sound professional, but her voice was shaky. "We'll keep working on your mobility." Taylor chuckled, his eyes glinting with mischief. "I have to say, nurse, you've been a huge help with my recovery. I'm not sure I could have done it without you. Or, at least, without your tender care." Xenia's pulse quickened, and she tried to hide her blush by adjusting her medical kit. She couldn't deny the way her body reacted to his words, though she cursed herself for it. He was a patient, and she couldn't let her emotions get in the way of her duties. "Let's get through the rest of the session," she said, her voice firm but strained. "I'll be with you every step of the way." Taylor smirked and sat up, flexing his muscles for effect. "I bet you will." The rest of the session passed in a haze of awkward tension. Xenia tried to stay focused, guiding him through stretches and light exercises, but it was hard to ignore the electric pull between them. She couldn't stop herself from stealing glances at his strong, athletic build, the way his muscles rippled under his skin with each movement. It was hard not to imagine what it would feel like to be close to him in a way that wasn't purely professional. At one point, when she adjusted his form during a squat, her hands lingered on his hips a moment too long. The brief contact sent a wave of heat through her, and she pulled back quickly, her heart pounding. Taylor's breath hitched, and he glanced up at her, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Careful, nurse," he teased, his voice thick with suggestion. "I think you might be enjoying this a little too much." Xenia froze, her cheeks blazing with embarrassment. She couldn't deny the truth in his words, though. Each touch, each fleeting glance, was becoming more difficult to ignore. But she had to remain composed. She had to remind herself that this was dangerous territory, especially given her position. "I'm just trying to help you get better," she replied stiffly, her voice betraying the nervous tension that lay beneath the surface. Taylor leaned in closer, his voice low and quiet. "Well, if you ever need to take a break from all this therapy, I'm more than happy to help you with a little distraction." Xenia's heart leapt into her throat, and she quickly stepped back, her hands trembling. His words hung in the air, charged with the kind of tension that she didn't know how to handle. Was he flirting, or was this just his way of making light of the situation? Either way, it made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite explain. "That's enough for today," she said, her tone more abrupt than she had intended. "You're making progress, Sergeant. We'll continue tomorrow." Taylor's grin faded slightly, but he didn't push further. Instead, he nodded, his eyes still holding that familiar, mischievous gleam. "As you wish, nurse, but I'll be waiting for our next session. And next time, maybe we can make things a little easier for both of us." Xenia quickly turned and left the room, her heart racing. She knew she needed to set clear boundaries, but she couldn't help but feel a magnetic pull toward him. Despite her best efforts, her body was betraying her. And, deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer she could resist him. That evening, as she prepared for bed in her quarters, Xenia couldn't shake the memory of Taylor's words. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, wondering if she was reading too much into it. Was it just flirtation? Or was there something more behind his teasing smile? She sighed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her emerald skin seemed almost unnatural in the dim light, and the cool blue of her hair gave her an alien appearance. But the strange warmth she felt when thinking about Taylor reminded her that, for once, she wasn't just a nurse on duty. She was a woman with desires, with emotions she had never felt before. The next day, she found herself back in the hospital, her heart already racing as she headed toward Taylor's room. She could hardly believe she was allowing herself to feel this way about a patient, but something about him drew her in. When she entered his room, her eyes met his, and she couldn't help but notice the glint of amusement in his expression. "Hello, nurse," he greeted with a grin. "Ready for round two?" Xenia forced herself to remain composed, though her cheeks flushed a deep shade of green. Let's just get through today's session, Sergeant. As she helped him through the stretches, Xenia couldn't ignore the growing tension in the room. Each touch, each glance, made her pulse quicken. She was in dangerous territory, but she couldn't help herself. Her heart was racing, and she knew the line between professionalism and something far more personal was growing blurrier with every passing moment. The days following their last therapy session felt like a whirlwind. Xenia was torn between the need to maintain professionalism and the undeniable pull she felt towards Sergeant Taylor. She was doing everything in her power to remain focused on her duties, but every glance, every word exchanged with him seemed to deepen the connection, or perhaps the confusion, she felt. Each time she walked into his room, her heart beat a little faster, her thoughts drifting more dangerously toward the idea of something more than just patient and nurse. And every time Taylor's blue eyes met hers, that mischievous smile playing on his lips, she felt herself teetering on the edge of something she knew she shouldn't. That afternoon, as she prepared for yet another physical therapy session, Xenia mentally steeled herself. This time, she promised herself would be different. She would keep things strictly professional. No more lingering glances. No more touches that lasted a second too long. She had to, for both their sakes. When she entered Taylor's room, he was sitting on the edge of his bed, stretching his injured leg with the kind of focused determination that had always impressed her. His toned body was wrapped in loose gym clothes, and as usual, he looked effortlessly attractive. "Hey, nurse," he greeted, looking up at her with that trademark smirk. "I was wondering if you'd show up today. You've been keeping me waiting." Xenia forced a smile, her cheeks flushing slightly as she approached. "We have a lot of work to do today, Sergeant. Let's get started." She gestured toward the mat, trying to remain composed. Taylor, ever the playful patient, stood and walked over to the exercise area, his eyes never leaving hers. He was definitely flirting, no way around it, and that only made Xenia more determined to keep things in check. He lay down on the mat, and Xenia knelt beside him, beginning to assist him with a series of stretches to improve his mobility. As her hands adjusted his leg, she couldn't help but notice the way his muscles tensed under her touch, the way his body responded to her proximity. "Feels good, nurse," Taylor murmured, his voice low and smooth. "You've got a real talent for this. Maybe I should get injured more often." Xenia looked up at him, her hands pausing for a moment as she tried to maintain her composure. "That's not necessary, Sergeant. I'm just doing my job." Taylor's gaze darkened slightly, and he tilted his head, his smile widening. "It's more than just a job, Xenia. You've been taking care of me a lot. I can't help but notice how you're always here, always so attentive. I'm starting to think you like it." Xenia's heart skipped a beat. She knew she was in dangerous territory now, but his words stirred something inside her, something she had been trying so hard to bury. She looked away, focusing on his leg, trying to force the words back down her throat. "Let's just keep it professional," she replied quietly, not trusting her voice to sound steady. Taylor sat up slightly, closing the distance between them, and the air between them became charged. "Professional," he repeated, almost like a challenge. "But there's nothing wrong with getting to know each other better, is there? I mean, it's just a little touch, a little connection." Xenia's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, her pulse quickening as Taylor's hand brushed against her own. She quickly pulled her hand back, her thoughts racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't how she was supposed to act. But the way he looked at her, the way his body was so close, it was difficult to remain distant. "I shouldn't be doing this," Xenia whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "You're a patient. I'm here to help you, not to." Taylor interrupted her with a soft, almost playful chuckle. "Come on, Xenia. You can't honestly say you haven't felt this." He gestured between them. "This tension. We both know it's there." Xenia took a shaky breath, her mind racing as she stood up, distancing herself from him. She was about to say something else when Taylor, with surprising speed, grabbed her hand, pulling her back toward him. For a moment, they both froze. Xenia's eyes widened as she looked down at their locked hands, her heart pounding so loudly it was all she could hear. "I've been waiting for you to make a move," Taylor said, his voice husky and low. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. His breath was warm on her skin, and for a brief, dangerous moment, Xenia was sure she could feel his pulse matching hers. He was giving her a look that seemed to say he wanted her. He wanted her in a way that wasn't just about physical recovery. Her mind screamed at her to pull away, to walk out of the room and put an end to this madness. But her body didn't listen. Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and she let herself feel the heat of his closeness, the way his hand gripped hers like he wouldn't let go. Before she could even think of what to say, Taylor closed the distance and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, hesitant kiss, but one filled with undeniable need, a hunger that had been building between them for days. Xenia's eyes flew open in shock, but her body betrayed her as she melted into the kiss. She could feel the weight of everything, the duty, the guilt, the fear, but she couldn't stop herself from responding. Her hands gripped his shoulders, pulling herself closer, feeling the hard muscles beneath his skin. She hadn't meant for this to happen, but it was. Taylor broke the kiss just long enough to look into her eyes. "I've wanted this from the moment I saw you," he whispered, his voice low, almost like a plea. "You're more than just a nurse to me, Xenia. You're everything." Xenia's mind spun. She knew she should have stopped. She knew this was wrong. But every instinct in her screamed for more. And as Taylor's lips met hers again, she didn't fight it. She gave in to the moment, giving in to the overwhelming, dangerous connection between them. But as they pulled away again, panting slightly, Xenia's heart raced with a terrifying realization. What had they just done? And where would it lead? This was a line they couldn't uncross. But deep down, she didn't know if she wanted to. Taylor looked up at her, his expression serious now. "I'm not going anywhere, Xenia. Whatever this is between us, it's only just beginning." Xenia's breath hitched in her throat, and she stared at him, torn between fear and desire. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, and the thought sent a shiver down her spine. Xenia sat at the edge of Taylor's bed, her thoughts swirling in chaotic disarray. The kiss they had shared wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness. It was a turning point, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Her body still hummed with the warmth of his touch, and her mind raced with the weight of what had just happened. The intensity of it all sent tremors of excitement and regret through her. The sterile glow of the medbay's fluorescent lights seemed harsher today, almost oppressive, as if the universe was reminding her that she had stepped into uncharted territory. She needed to get her bearings, needed to regain control. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how impossible that would be. Taylor lay beside her, his breathing slow and even, eyes closed as if he were deep in sleep. But the slight smile playing on his lips told her he wasn't as oblivious as he appeared. He was awake, and he was content, his hand resting lightly over his chest as though he knew exactly what had happened. Xenia swallowed hard, her heart still pounding in her chest as she forced herself to stand. I shouldn't have done that," she muttered, half to herself, as she turned away to gather the medical supplies she'd left scattered across the counter. Taylor stirred, his voice rough but warm. "Xenia," he said her name softly, with an almost teasing quality. "You can't say that and expect me to believe it." She felt her pulse quicken at the sound of her name from his lips, but she steeled herself. "It doesn't change anything, Taylor," she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. She turned back to face him, finding his piercing blue eyes watching her closely, his grin playful. "You're a patient, and I'm—" She stopped herself, not wanting to continue with that line of thinking. She wasn't supposed to feel this way about him. His grin only widened as he sat up, his gaze never leaving hers. "A patient?" He gave a low, playful chuckle. "I might be your patient, Xenia, but I'm not blind. You're not just here to take care of me." He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until the air between them felt charged again. "And you're not fooling anyone. I can see it in the way you look at me." Xenia's breath hitched, her pulse racing as she felt her resolve weakening. She couldn't deny the truth in his words. There was something more. The chemistry between them was undeniable, electric. It wasn't just in their stolen glances or the lingering touches. There was a depth to it now. She had felt it from the moment he'd first smiled at her. But that didn't change the fact that she was a professional, And this was a dangerous path to walk down. She could lose everything: the trust of her colleagues, her standing at the station, maybe even her career. "I'm your nurse, Taylor," Xenia said, her voice wavering. "I can't, this isn't right. I'm not supposed to." Taylor cut her off, his voice low and steady. "What's right or wrong here doesn't really matter, does it? We're not following the rules anymore, Xenia. The moment I woke up in this hospital, I could feel it. Something between us. And I know you did too." Xenia stared at him, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. He was right, but she didn't want him to be right. She couldn't afford to let her heart, or her instincts, get the best of her. But as he continued, something inside her broke. The words he spoke felt like a revelation, a release of the tension that had been building between them for days. "I've wanted this," he continued, his voice gentle now, almost tender. "I've wanted you since the moment I laid eyes on you. And I know that you want this too. Don't deny it." Her breath caught, her mind screaming at her to step back, to run away from the fire that threatened to consume them both. But her body wouldn't obey. Every fiber of her being was drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. Xenia closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she took a deep breath. She was torn, feeling the weight of responsibility bearing down on her. But in the quiet of the room, the gravity of the situation wasn't enough to pull her away from him. No, it was the pull of Taylor's gaze that kept her rooted in place. When she opened her eyes, she saw him standing up, taking slow, deliberate steps toward her, as if every motion was designed to test the waters between them. The air seemed thicker now, charged with the energy of their shared tension. "I'm not going to let you push me away, Xenia," he said softly, reaching for her hand. His touch was gentle, but firm, and as she looked up at him, the conflict in her heart was clear. She wanted this. She knew she wanted this. But the risk was daunting. Taylor read her hesitation and offered a small, knowing smile. "We don't have to rush things," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. We can take this slow, figure it out as we go. But I promise you, I'm not leaving." Xenia felt her heart hammer in her chest, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to say something sensible, something that would protect her from the whirlwind of emotions that had already begun sweeping her away. But the truth was, she didn't want to say no. Not to him. "Taylor," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hand shook as she reached for his, but she didn't pull away. His eyes softened, and for the first time, Xenia saw vulnerability in his gaze. "I'm not afraid of this," he murmured, drawing her closer until she could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. "I don't want you to be either." The moment between them was electric, charged with every unspoken word, every doubt that still lingered in the back of Xenia's mind. And as he leaned in, his lips meeting hers once again, she couldn't find the strength to resist. This wasn't just an attraction anymore. It wasn't just the thrill of forbidden desire. This was something else, something deeper, something neither of them could deny. As Taylor deepened the kiss, Xenia melted into his embrace, her doubts, her fears, everything she'd held on to, fading into the background. The only thing that mattered now was the two of them together in this moment. And as the door slid shut behind them, sealing them in their shared space, Xenia knew they were about to embark on something neither of them could have prepared for. A journey where every boundary was blurred, and every step forward was a leap into the unknown. But at this point, she didn't care, because for the first time in a long while she felt alive. And this was just the beginning.